Batman is without a doubt one of DC's most famous characters and definitely one of its most iconic characters. And that is why this is a character that has gotten so many different iterations, both in live action and in animation. And I know on this channel that I often praise the DCAU. However, a show that to me gets criminally underrated is the 2004 The Batman series that I see almost no one ever talk about and no one ever mention, which is a real shame because this show actually did a lot of things very, very well and was very enjoyable despite all of the limitations that were placed on this specific show. And that's why today we're talking the Batman 2004 was criminally underrated. But before we get into anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. All right, the Batman 2004. As I mentioned at the beginning, this show definitely faced a couple of obstacles very early on. The first obstacle being that this is the first Batman animated show after Batman the Animated Series. Now, I do know we did get Batman Beyond and the New Adventures of Batman. However, those were literally extensions from Batman the Animated Series, with the New Adventures of Batman literally still being from the same creator, having all of the same voice actors, and the only change was some animation style changes. So I don't count those as different series. Those are more like sequel series than anything. So considering this was going to be their first attempt at a new Batman since before Batman the Animated Series, with how much success that show had, yeah, you can definitely understand how this series was up against it right off the bat. However, it also encountered something else, something that was newer from Warner Brothers, and that something newer was called the Batman Embargo. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Batman Embargo, just to explain it really quickly, was basically a set of rules that Warner Brothers did come out with that surrounded any animated projects and limited them from using certain characters that were currently appearing in the Nolan trilogy and that were going to appear in any live action project. And their justification for this was to not dilute the characters and not make different versions of characters that would either take away the weight and the gravity of seeing said character in a live action movie, but also they don't want to tarnish what people think about that character if for whatever reason the iteration of said character used in an animated series wasn't well liked by the general audience, which to me sounds very silly. As a comic book fan, I think it is very easy to differentiate, especially animation with live action. Never once have I questioned whether a live action project was going to be impacted by an animated project. That just seems very silly to me. A lot of people definitely agree. However, that placed a tremendous amount of limitations on this series right off the bat. So not only did this series have to compete with being the first show after Batman the Animated Series to represent this iconic character of Batman, but it also now had something called the Batman Embargo, which just made things 10 times harder. And side note, I will be doing a deep dive on the Batman Embargo on a video down the line, so stay tuned for that. And speaking of future videos, I did see a couple people wanted me to add the Batman Season 6 to my What Could Have Been series, so look out for that video next Monday. So if you want to stay tuned for that, make sure to subscribe, hit the noti bell, because I will be posting that video next Monday. But back to the Batman 2004 series as we know it today. So in watching this show, they wanted to differentiate it from Batman the Animated Series basically in any way possible. So how do you do that? Well, first and foremost, you change the age of the character. In Batman the Animated Series, he was about 10 to 12 years into his career as Batman. We know this thanks to the flashback moments of when we first had Dick Grayson be introduced and everything that happened with that. And then now we obviously know that he is proceeding through college. So Bruce Wayne has been Batman for about 10 to 12 years in that universe. So the 2004 series did make it so this is a much more early on version of Batman, and making that very clear in the first episode as he celebrates 3 years ago tonight he first donned the cape and cowl. So that definitely sets us up already for a very different story and a very different character of Batman. However, they weren't done there, because not only did they want to differentiate themselves from the story of the Batman the Animated Series, they also had to compete with that embargo that I mentioned. So certain characters were not allowed to be in this series. And in particular, I'm talking about members of the police force. If you watch this show, you will notice that Commissioner Gordon is not there, at least not in the beginning. And this is because they were not allowed to use him in those beginning seasons. So they had to do something creative. And what they did was they came up with Chief Angel Rojas. And not only that, they came up with Detective Ellen Yin and Detective Ethan Bennett. And to me, I feel like this worked really well. Chief Angel Rojas was someone that was very dislikable and someone who was just out to get the Batman, and that was essentially everything about his core character. He didn't have any redeeming characteristics. But when we look at the two detectives, this was not the case because Detective Ellen Yin was very, in my opinion, unlikable in season 1 because she was very by the book. She was very of the mindset that Batman is a vigilante, so he needs to be brought to justice. Even though he just saved us, even though he just stopped the bad guy, even though he was trying to save us, we still need to bring him in. Ethan Bennett, on the other hand, was the very likable cop right from the start. He always empathized and sympathized with Batman, thanking Batman on multiple occasions, and even letting Batman go on multiple occasions. And now, why is this very important? Well, that's because not only was this detective Ethan Bennett supposed to be the more likable of the two, at least in the beginning, he also had a personal connection to Bruce Wayne, and that was explored. They were childhood best friends. And not only were they best friends, Ethan Bennett was someone that Bruce Wayne was considering telling the big secret to. That big secret being that Bruce Wayne is indeed the Batman. It got to the point where in episode 12 of season 1, Batman had made up his mind. And if what happened to Ethan Bennett didn't happen, he would have been brought into the greater Bat family. And speaking of what happened to Ethan Bennett, this is why I think what they chose to do was absolutely brilliant, because they did change certain characters and they made them not be as tragic. However, they also added more nuance to certain characters. One of those characters being Clayface. Yes, Clayface is a tragic character a lot of times, especially in Batman the Animated Series. However, he didn't have any personal connection to Batman. So there was no personal trauma that Batman undertook because of that transformation. But this series changed that. In this series, it showed us Ethan Bennett getting kidnapped by the Joker, getting tormented for days and days on end, both psychological and physical. And after all that torment, he was subjected to this experimental chemical that the Joker had spilled on him. And because of that, he became Clayface. And we saw as the series progressed, him struggle with this, him try to become good again, but those urges of being bad. And in even one moment, he says being Ethan Bennett is so hard, but being Clayface, that is cake. So it just presented a very unique storyline that we were able to then follow that had the Batman feeling for his friend who is now this great villain. And not only that, it also helped us to start liking Detective Ellen Yin because she started to see that the Batman isn't that bad of a person. And just because the law says we should bring him in doesn't mean we necessarily have to do that. And we saw this in the finale of season 1. She decides to let him go. And she even says, the last time we met, I told you, next time I would be taking you in, but she doesn't. And she says that her entire perspective has changed. And this is in large part due to what happened to Ethan Bennett. And now she obviously does not know that he is Bruce Wayne, so they don't have that personal connection, but she did still see how much Batman was truly trying to help this person. And then moving forward, they start to develop a partnership, so much so that in season 2, they are working side by side together with a dynamic that is very similar to what Batman and Commissioner Gordon traditionally have. And this was a very cool switch up because it definitely, to me, added even more layers, because a lot of times when you have Commissioner Gordon and Batman, it is really cool. However, you don't have someone pressuring Commissioner Gordon to track Batman down. A lot of times, if Commissioner Gordon is still on the police force, this can be a storyline that we do see explored. However, in the Nolanverse, that didn't really happen. To a point, it did in Batman Begins, but still, it was really cool to see. To me, in season 2, them having Detective Yin become the partner of Batman was an amazing decision. I think it really helped the growth and development of not only Detective Ellen Yin, but also of Batman, because by this point, he hadn't known how to work with someone else. Yes, there was Alfred, but that was more of a father and son dynamic versus an actual partnership, working together for one goal. And I feel like over the course of season 2, we got to see that bond grow
grow between the two of them. So much so that Detective Ellen Yin was willing to sacrifice her job for the sake of Batman, something that season 1 Ellen Yin probably wouldn't have done. And not only that, us fans probably could not have seen that coming based on what we saw from her in season 1. However, after the events of season 2, Detective Ellen Yin is let go from the force, at least the force in Gotham. She does end up transferring to another city, and this is where we finally do get introduced to Commissioner Gordon, and now he is going to be in the show outright. Right? Not really. Thanks to that great Batman Embargo, which again I mentioned I will cover in another video, so make sure to stay tuned. But that being said, we do get Commissioner Gordon in a way. Now, what I mean by that is he was not allowed to be directly involved in a lot of the conflicts, and that's why they introduced Batgirl and had him as more of either a fatherly figure or as a captain of the police force versus him working directly hand in hand with Batman. Now, there were a couple instances where they did get away with him actually being in on the action. However, even that was somewhat limited with him being kidnapped by Poison Ivy or him being taken over by a plant version of himself. This was a way for him to still be a main stake in the storyline while still having something different enough from what the live action movies were doing. Again, it's stupid. I personally hate it like a lot of fans, but I am still glad that they were able to in some way involve Commissioner Gordon in this storyline. So a couple of the other things that this series did do that I absolutely love, the combat in the series was amazing. They decided that every single one of Batman's villains is going to be able to throw hands. The Joker, the Penguin, Catwoman, Ragdoll, every single character that appeared was absolutely badass. There's a moment where the Penguin does this jump kick and literally kicks in the air probably 8 to 10 times and just keeps going. He is literally a martial artist in this series, and I absolutely love it. I think it is a really cool take on the character of the Penguin. It still keeps some of the core elements of his character while adding some nuance. The Joker in this series, not great, but again, thanks to that great embargo, he was probably the most limited character that we actually got in this series. Speaking of limited, Lucius Fox also made a couple appearances, however, not till later on because, yeah, the Batman Embargo. Again, like I said, stay tuned for that video because that'll probably be coming out next week. Can't wait to talk about that. Thanks, Warner Brothers, and your amazing ideas as usual. But with that being said, some of the other notable changes from this series, that iconic theme song, obviously we all remember the Batman the Animated Series theme song, intro, everything. This one, in my opinion, might have been better. At least the first 2 seasons. They inevitably changed it, which I think was a horrible mistake. However, the first 2 seasons theme song is absolutely amazing, and I think it might be my favorite theme song for a Batman animated project ever. The art style was significantly different. Again, some of this was to help differentiate certain characters, specifically the Joker. He couldn't even have shoes on for the most part. That's why they literally had his bare feet showing almost every time he was on screen. Some of the other rules were really weird too around this series, but still, considering every rule that this series had to go up against, and considering this was the first Batman series after Batman the Animated Series, I think it did a really great job at establishing the character and making the connections that they were able to have in the show very special. Batman and Ellen Yin is something I cared about. Batman and Alfred not only built upon what we got in the DCAU, but explored it to a point that I think it was even better. And yes, I absolutely love the dynamic between Bruce Wayne and Alfred in the DCAU. However, I feel like this series just gave us even more. It is a slightly younger Alfred, so I think that did contribute to a degree because this version of Alfred is able to physically help Bruce Wayne and Batman in a much larger scale way. And I just feel like that leads to their bond being solidified even more. Like that moment where Dracula is going to literally kill Batman and Alfred decides to stand against him. Yeah, that's friendship, that's brotherhood, that is fatherly love. So absolutely love to see that. And this version of Batman is probably the strongest that we've ever seen in animation. Again, I love Kevin Conroy's Batman. However, this version of Batman literally holds up the Batmobile with a grappling hook and one arm at one point. He's boxing with Dracula with Killer Croc. He is going head to head with people who have unworldly strength and yet still is either tanking hits from them or knocking them out and or beating their ass. So this was a version of Batman that was definitely advertised as being smarter, faster, and stronger than we have ever seen before. And they went out of their way to show that with amazing combat scenes. And that's where I feel like this series definitely shined, maybe even a little more so than Batman the Animated Series, just because of the timing in which Batman the Animated Series did come out. They were a bit more limited as far as the animation that they did have for the series, whereas this one coming out in the early 2000s did have access to better animation, so they could make those fight scenes that much better. And let me tell you, it is almost like night and day. Again, I prefer Batman the Animated Series. However, the Batman 2004 definitely hands down has the best fights in any Batman animated show, in my opinion. It's just absolutely great. Looks great. The transitions look really good. And this Batman definitely has a pretty high IQ because he does show the ability to outwit his opponents when he isn't able to just beat their ass, which doesn't happen too often because, like I said before, this version of the Batman is an absolute unit. However, not everything that the series did do was that great. Getting into some of the things that I was not a huge fan of. I didn't like how they used the Joker, just this iteration of the Joker. Again, I know that isn't their fault. They were basically forced to use this version of the Joker. Again, stay tuned for that video. It'll come out next week because I've got a lot to say about this Batman Embargo and how absolutely stupid it is. But aside from that, some of the other things that I was not a huge fan of in this series was how rushed it felt in the end. They tried to shoehorn the Justice League all into that final season, and it left it feeling very weird. And that's why I said I also want to do another video next week covering what season 6 would have looked like, because there are a ton of unused plans that to me sound even better than a lot of what we got in season 5. Not saying season 5 was bad, it just objectively compared to the other 4 seasons was the worst and definitely could have been much better if they didn't force all of those characters into this one season, which they basically had to do. Some of the other things I wasn't a huge fan of, like I mentioned a little earlier, they did change certain characters, some because they had to, but some they just chose to. One of those changes was Mr. Freeze. I personally absolutely love how Mr. Freeze was done in the DCAU. He is by far one of my favorite supervillains, and especially favorite Batman villains. So that being said, having that version of Mr. Freeze now compared to this version of Mr. Freeze, I'm definitely going to like it far less. Again, I do understand they want to make it different than the original series and go back to him just being more of a bank robber, more of being a less likable character, a less redeemable character, and a more just downright evil person. But that being said, I am still going to lean towards that Batman the Animated Series version of this character versus this one. However, I will say the suit design for Mr. Freeze is by far my absolute favorite in the entire show, and it is my favorite design for any Mr. Freeze we've ever gotten in any media, whether it's a game, TV show, or movie. It just looks absolutely amazing. I love the helmet. I love the fact that he can actually shoot ice from his hands. That's absolutely brilliant. Let's get rid of the cold gun. That's something I actually liked. One of the changes I really liked about this series. And just making more fantastical characters in this series was another choice that I thought was really interesting. Like the Riddler in this universe to me is a bit more fantastical. He can actually fight versus being just more of a bookworm. They even give him a slightly different appearance with that long hair, very slender body, and then that staff that can push a button and magically do anything, it seems like, which is absolutely hilarious. But all in all, I do think this series is criminally underrated. I do think it has some of the best fights we've ever gotten in DC animated shows. It has some really good storylines as well, and it has characters that we grow to care about. Ellen Yin has one of the best arcs in the entire show. She's one of the best characters, in my opinion, in the whole show. Batgirl and Robin are also set up in the show very well. One of my only critiques of the DCAU is how they handled Batgirl and Robin. I feel like there could have been more done with them, and I feel like this series just executes that aspect of it really well. I wish season 5 handled certain things a little bit different just to help with that a little more. But again, that will be a topic for my video next week, what could have been for season 6. But I want to know what all of you think. Do you agree with me that the 2004 The Batman series is criminally underrated, or do you think it is overrated? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And I'll see all of you in the next video. Goodbye.